Welcome to this year's virtual SCA Leadership Retreat. We are excited you have decided to join us. My name is Al Spada, and I am your Executive Director for NCSEA. Before we begin, I have a few announcements for you. First, this presentation is being recorded and will be made available to you through the NCSEA website. Second, if you have questions for our keynote speaker, please type them into the Q&A pod and they will be addressed at the end of his presentation. Feel free to use the chat pod to engage with your fellow attendees. Last, there is still time to register for the committee interaction sessions, SEA education sessions, and the closing celebration occurring throughout this week. Please visit the NCSEA website to register now. I will now turn the microphone over to NCSEA past president, Emily Guglielmo, for a few remarks and to introduce today's keynote speaker.
Welcome to the 2021 NCSEA SCA Leadership Retreat. My name is Emily Guglielmo, and I've just completed my term as your NCSEA president. We have two important goals associated with this event. The first is an all-in approach to supporting and strengthening our SEAs through presentations, interactive sessions, and committee collaborations. The second is to appropriately celebrate an enormously successful fiscal year, honor our outgoing board members, and welcome our incoming leadership. The retreat will continue through Thursday and will include a number of expert presentations. Topics include member engagement, revenue streams, virtual networking, effective management of your SEA, diversity, equity, and inclusion at the local level, and recruiting the next generation. In addition, I encourage you to participate in the committee interactive sessions sprinkled throughout the next 3 days. Lastly, a special request to please join us Thursday afternoon for our end of year celebrations, the passing of the gavel, and to honor our outgoing board members. I'd like to begin with a quick recap of our successful past year. Our fiscal year and my presidency began the moment the pandemic gripped the United States. NCSEA leadership buckled down, focused on our financial viability, and took advantage of the unique challenges to advance NCSEA. The credit for our successes and the implementation of our strategy and initiatives rests with our committees. To that end, I'd like to briefly share their successes over the past year. The Basic Education Committee welcomed 2 new chairs, Scott Francis and Judy Liu. They completed their practitioner survey, generating feedback from all of you regarding the most necessary skills for new graduates entering the workforce. Their results were published in Structure magazine, communicating their findings with universities and empowering NCSEA to fill that gap between our new graduates and our firm expectations. The Code Advisory Committee, chaired by Tom DeBlasi, utilized an off year from the ICC code cycle to focus upon the education of our practicing engineers. This focus included summit sessions, white papers, and the planning stages of an Ask the Expert forum. The External Communications Committee, chaired by Angelina Stasulis and Jara Likely, assisted the NCSEA board to partner with a public relations firm to augment the knowledge of our profession beyond our traditional audiences. The Internal Communications Committee, chaired by Michelle Ryland and Rob Butterfield, curated and hosted our first ever SEA Leadership Retreat last summer, as well as the current retreat today. Between these events, they hosted delegate mixers, focus groups, and monthly collaboration sessions between SEA leaders. The Continuing Education Committee, chaired by Carrie Johnson and Mike Tilk, not only provided relevant content to practicing engineers, but increased the frequency and delivery methods to support each of our members while isolated within their own homes. The Publications Committee, chaired by Tim Mays and Chun Lau, survived a publishing partner going out of business mid-publication as they finalized our brand new excavation and shoring guide and the irregular diaphragm update guide. The Resilience Committee, chaired by Kevin Moore, authored an innovative article sharing lessons learned from the COVID pandemic and themes for our profession as we work towards increasing our community's resilience. The Structural Engineering Emergency Response, or SEER Committee, chaired by David Troxel and Colby Baker, provided webinars of Cal OES SAP training and strengthened our partnership with FEMA via development of post-disaster response material, and ICC through the generation of our roster of qualified disaster emergency response engineers. The COVID pandemic couldn't slow down our Structural Engineering Engagement and Equity, or better known as SE3 Committee. Chaired by Sabrina Duke, they completed our profession's third survey with over 5,000 respondents, followed by survey evaluation and release of topic briefs. In addition, the committee hosted the first ever SE3 Spring Series last month. The Licensure Committee, chaired by Alan Kirkpatrick and Kristen Kilgore, supported 4 states involved in advancing licensure legislation, including Florida, Texas, Alabama, and the successful passing of a Partial Practice Act in Georgia. The Summit Committee, chaired by longtime volunteer and CSEA member Carrie Johnson, hosted our first ever wildly successful virtual summit in 2020. And the Sustainable Design Committee, chaired by Kelly Roberts, developed a very strong relationship with SEI's Sustainable Committee and advancing the SE 2050 initiative and generating educational materials to share with all of our SEAs. And lastly, but not least, the Young Member Group Support Committee, chaired by Eric McAlra, hosted their annual trivia night, strengthened their liaison program, and issued young member scholarships to attend the summit. If any of these particular initiatives is of interest to you or your SEA, please plan to drop in on that committee during their collaboration session in the next 3 days. In addition to our committee's efforts, we realized several other important advancements within NCSEA. We enhanced our external voice by drafting, distributing, and implementing a social media guide for SEAs and engineers. In addition, we partnered with, as I mentioned, a strategic outreach specialist to assist us with tactics and implementation with engaging audiences outside of our profession. This past year, NCSEA fully committed to this novel new graduate initiative. This program aims to provide sophisticated training modules, focusing on a wide spectrum of topics to train our firm's new graduates. The first module, Masonry, is underway and provides 3D building models, written and verbal training, sample problems to provide a complete training module. This past June, NCSEA issued a call to action to denounce racism and commit to furthering equity, diversity, and inclusion in our associations and the profession. And while these words represented a critical step to establishing a vision and a commitment to accountability, it is actions that lead to meaningful progress. To that end, NCSEA publicly pledged to a number of actionable DEI goals. Some of those goals have been achieved in the past year, including hosting a DEI visioning and planning session for NCSEA leadership, including board, staff, and committee chairs. We offered a 3-part series on equity in structural engineering, covering implicit bias, cultural humility, and improving the diversity of the structural engineering pipeline. We committed to formal partnering agreements with the National Society of Black Engineers, or NSBE, and the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, or SHIP. And we've launched our first ever annual diversity scholarship program. Also this last year, NCSEA, CASE, and SEI developed actions to support our 2019 joint vision for the future of structural engineering. In this document, the 3 organizations envisioned a future in which structural engineers are widely recognized as vital contributors to the advancement of our society. The 3 organizations met on multiple occasions to implement initiatives ranging from licensure to leadership training, from mentorship to messaging, and from public perception to policy development. In support of this goal, on February 23rd, the presidents from the 3 organizations, CASE, NCSEA, and SEI, hosted a virtual town hall called For the Betterment of the Structural Engineering Profession, open to engineers across the country. The town hall informed our colleagues regarding current and proposed initiatives to advance the profession and to enhance our member engagement. During the town hall, we hosted an open question and answer session and heard from many of you. We are listening and are strategically planning our coming year directly based on the feedback you all provided. So for the last year, we have been mostly unable to see our colleagues in person. We're accustomed to celebrating our projects and our people, shaking hands with our colleagues, sitting shoulder to shoulder to learn from experts, and having late night drinks with our friends. While social distancing may have been the necessity, it is the antithesis of NCSEA's rich history of bringing like-minded people together as we move the profession forward. Through it all, NCSEA has remained committed to using the most relevant and resonant mechanisms to connect with our membership. We're making consistent progress with novel learning and networking opportunities, and we're strategically planning for today's and tomorrow's challenges. We're so proud you have joined us here in our second annual SEA Leadership Retreat. I hope these few examples reinforce to you, my colleagues, that NCSEA has been engaged, productive, and listening to our members. Speaking for the entire NCSEA board and staff, we have been privileged to serve you during this time of both challenge and opportunity. With that, it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Mark Engle. Mark is a principal with Association Management Center. He's a frequent author and speaker on governance and high-performing organizations, and is a faculty member of the ASAE Exceptional Boards Program. Today, Mark will be speaking to us about leading our SEAs into the future and engaging in the new normal. Please join me in welcoming Mark to NCSEA's Leadership Retreat.
Hello, NCSEA. It is a privilege to be with you today as you're involved in your leadership retreat, and I'm very certain that you would rather be face-to-face, as I would too with you, but in these days and times, we do what we do, right? So it's a pleasure to be together. You have to know how passionate I am about associations. I've been in the association community for over 35 years, both on the staff side and on the volunteer leadership side. And currently I'm on 6 boards of directors, which is not recommended, by the way. But I do understand what it is to be a board member and an officer of an association and a staff member. So I come through all vantage points, if you will. Hopefully you've received a PDF of these slides. Some of them will be fairly intricate, and our concept is not to go through them in detail, but to share with you resources that are available to you in this association space. We'll engage in some chat along the way and hopefully make this a nice engaging session that can stimulate you and reward you for your leadership position in the association. So let's get into it. I'd like to start out with some what I consider to be inspirational quotes, and hopefully you will too. So in the chat, you might want to, if you recognize the quote and who was the quoter, you could share via chat. I like the first one. We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. Who said that? Make a living by what we get, which is our day jobs, if you will, where our payroll comes from. But we make a life by what we give. And in the context of the association environment, we have volunteer leadership that are giving. They're giving of their time and talent, and not to mention their dues and so on. And so coming together makes life better by dealing with volunteer leaders. And we find that as inspirational so often in our space. Hopefully you recognize that as Winston Churchill. I actually believe he actually saved the world. The second quote's a little bit different. If you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so in the context of association leadership, we know that making group decisions can slow the process down. So if you want to make a quick decision, make it individually. But if you want to go far with your achievements and your performance as an organization, we find that the construct around decision making improves decision quality. So come together. You might have recognized this quote as an old African proverb. It is really inspiring in our space. The last one's a little bit closer to home in structural engineering. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood and probably themselves will not be realized. Aim high in hope and work. Now, I'm from Chicago, and Daniel Burnham was an inspiration to Chicago and such an important part of our development. So I think this context that he provides, dream big, come together and achieve big plans. If we set our sights small, we won't make a big impact. We set our sights big and come together. It's amazing what we can do together. This next one's really in the context of associations because we believe that associations touch every life, every day, in every way. And when you think about it, there is an association for literally everything. In fact, ASAE, the American Society of Association Executives, says there's over 64,000 trade and professional associations in the US alone, one for every industry, profession, and interest that one can imagine. How many associations are you a member of? Associations make broad contributions to American life. In fact, they really help us build a stronger economy through industrial development, product and service innovation, and through facilitating domestic and international business. Not only do associations provide jobs, but they enhance job skills. We come together for professional development. We advance those job skills and create new employment opportunities across virtually every industry sector. We also improve systems and structures. This should be close to home for structural engineers, of course, by implementing programs and impacting policies that strengthen America's safety and security. We also strengthen lives. Volunteerism is a critical example in associations of people coming together in a voluntary way to improve standards of quality and safety, provide disaster relief, and so much more. Associations are so powerful. But what about structural engineers? In the chat, please contribute to this. Why are you important to society? What is it about structural engineers? I like to think that everything would fall apart without you. You're vested in the long-term welfare of people. Structures survive the test of time because of your expertise. Like my wife teases me that if I were to come back in a second life, I would love to be an engineer because I love to understand how things come apart and, more importantly, how they go together. You protect the safety of the public. It's hard to imagine life without you. Wow, what a contribution. And then let's come closer to home too about structural engineering organizations. So also in the chat, why don't you contribute to what benefit do structural engineering organizations provide to structural engineers? We often think in the context of bringing people together, which could be networking with like-minded people who have a similar interest and similar expertise. In fact, you get to share your experiences and learn from and with each other. You also get to celebrate your profession, both collectively and individually with accomplishments. Only associations have the capacity to cut across all elements within the profession. And what does that mean to advance society? We like to focus on some data about what's going on in the association community. And our good friend Dean West, who's an association researcher, published some data last year. And of course, most of this is COVID-related times, which we're still embracing, if you will. Embracing might not be the right word, but certainly we are engaged in COVID-related activities. Our world has changed as association leaders. And so Dean found out in his polling of association leaders about the key elements that are facing us. What are our challenges? Identifying and recruiting diverse leaders is actually the top of our list. What about who should be leading the organizations? What does that look like today, both in competence and in balance of diversity around our leadership tables? Getting volunteer leaders future focused, away from operations. I like to have the context of looking up and out. What's going on in our community we need to be thinking about? Away from the operations, which are things that we've already decided to do. And yet so often look on those key elements of what are we doing instead of where are we going. Also engaging younger members in volunteer leadership. We know that the generational elements are critical today in how people want to engage, their availability for time and patience, and their opportunity to go everywhere and anywhere for leadership opportunities. What about creating or sustaining a strategic board of directors? What was fourth on Dean's list of research about time on strategy at the board level? We'll get into these in just a little bit. What is your biggest challenge in your association? What does that look like today? We'll move on now from the data side to the experience side. I have the privilege to be co-facilitator of ASAE's Exceptional Boards program that brings together the volunteer and staff leadership of associations. And these are the areas that we are experiencing in our discussions. Understanding a value proposition for the association is critical. If we can't explain in a couple sentences why we belong and the value of our organization, then the members certainly can't understand it. As leaders, we need to understand what is our value proposition. We also have to be very sensitive to the competitive landscape. Associations are under assault these days, if you will. We have more competition in our space for the time and talent and treasure of our members than we've ever had before. We're also cognizant of mergers and acquisitions, not only at the association level, but also at our member companies levels that are supporting our members. M&A is at a furious pace these days, and the implications are significant for associations and our memberships. There are also generational issues and opportunities. We shared that on our prior slide too, about the generational elements of those of us who are retirement age. I'm a grandfather now and getting closer to retirement. And yet we also have this emerging early careerists who are hungry for information and networking. We have to be cognizant that we think differently, we have different expectations, and we have different limitations around our time and talent investments. The next thing I'm sure that we're all experiencing is technological change. How are we hooked up for this virtual environment? Are we converting our issues and programs and opportunities to technology-based? And what will that look like a year from now when we're hopefully all vaccinated and back to quote unquote, what is the normal? Last element, time famine is in a vivid element today versus where it has been in the past. We've always complained about not having available time in the past, but in today's environment is more timely, if you will, than ever before, because there's so much competition for time. These impacts are going to be significant to us. So let's get to what are the challenges you are likely facing. So again, in the chat, please share, what is your biggest challenge? Maybe particularly around these four, or you might have other outside challenges too. What about member retention, acquisition, or engagement? How is that working for you in this virtual environment today? Again, we're competing for so many opportunities for our members to engage. Are we retaining them? Are we actually building membership? And some organizations are, and engaging our members in a different way. What does that look like today? Is this a challenge you're facing? How about face-to-face meetings or virtual hybrid meetings? We're shifting to technology-based, and yet most of us are longing to get back together face-to-face. What are those environments? They have financial implications, as most associations have over 50% of their revenue in face-to-face meetings of some form and fashion or another. That P&L situation is very different in the hybrid environment or just a strictly virtual environment, of course. Are we converting these education offerings? Are we still having revenue based on them, or are they all expense? What does that look like? So what is your biggest challenge? What does that look like? So let's transition now to what are we doing about it? How are associations facing those challenges? What we see is, first of all, it is up to leadership. Volunteer leadership is critical to advancing the organization in good times and bad. Today, what we see is the habits of high-performing boards are significant. I referenced a little bit earlier about looking up and out. We talk about spending time on generative sessions at the board leadership level, looking up and out. What's coming into the future? Has COVID changed us forever? Has COVID changed us in the past that we're coming out of? What are those implications? Are people thinking differently? Are their expectations different? If we're not taking the time at the board level to have this discussion, then we're going to be reactive mode the whole time. We're going to talk about how do high-performing boards actually do that in a few minutes. Secondly, is high-performing boards build a healthy culture that is thoughtful, informed, courteous, and candid. Boy, a couple of years ago, we didn't have that word courteous in there because it was expected that we come to the table together and we treat each other with respect. How times have changed. But we have to be mindful of the culture that comes together. We're going to unpack that a little bit here too. So high-performing boards are thoughtful, informed, courteous, and candid to advance their performance. They also ask the question, are we ready to make a decision or not on this element? And when we're thinking about strategic issues, we do have the time to make a wise, consequential decision. Are we ready to do it? Do we have the information available to inform our decision? If not, can we pause and collect it? High-performing boards that are looking up and out have more time to make consequential decisions and less urgency. Now, the COVID environment has impacted that, obviously, but we should be out of this crisis mode by now. We've been in this element of COVID for quite some time. So if we're looking up and out enough and talking about strategic issues, we have the luxury of time to make a consequential decision. Are we ready to do that? And the last one we'll get into in a few minutes too, around individual member contributions at the leadership level. Members, board members, committee leaders have to come to our meetings prepared and be accountable for outcomes. What does that look like? So in the context of when we look at high-performing leadership teams in the association space, these are 4 of the key applications that we pursue. So let's get a little bit more granular on this. We do like the context of speed. And we all need an element of speed to make decisions, as we know. I like to start with Will Brown's quote on the left. What do high-performing boards do? They spend time curating strategy and embracing a culture driven by strong interpersonal relationships. Now, when I started doing the research around high-performing boards, it started about 15 years ago, so 20 years into my career. What is it that high-performing boards do differently than other boards of directors in the association space? And Will is a leading researcher out of Texas A&M and boiled it down to these 2 elements. Spending time in strategy, informing ourselves as to what is important and allocating the resources to do that is how we curate strategy. And then embracing the culture of how we do that. How do we work together? And being cognizant of these strong interpersonal relationships. And how has that been impacted in this virtual environment? Do we have the time and luxury to get to know each other and build these relationships that, as Will says, improve decision quality in association boards? And then Nancy Axelrod brings it down to a more granular level, talking about culture. What's that board culture? She wrote one of the most timeless pieces in our space. In fact, it's on our website, In the Boardroom, Culture Counts. I didn't appreciate this enough until I went back to school and dove into researching high-performing boards. And what we found out was generally have the competence at the board table, but if we don't have the culture that allows this element of trust to advance our teamwork, will allow us to have candid conversations and manage constructive conflict well, we are bringing our decision quality down to the lowest common denominator. So Nancy really spends time saying we have to build on these things. You have to trust first in the boardroom, build the teamwork to allow us to have candid conversations, which leads to constructive conflict. These are building blocks. Our article is timeless and so important on this cultural element within the board space. And Amy Edmondson really unpacks it even more granularly by talking about providing that safe space in the team environment that advances that composite of trust, as Nancy talks about, which is a respect for each other's competence and caring about each other as people. So to create that safe space by those two elements of competence and caring. And then that allows us to engage Nancy's next element. We have that trust built. We can come together as a team to make quality decisions. And the way we do that is to protect that space so we can have candor in the boardroom and actually manage constructive conflict. And when we do that, our research focuses on the point of advancing decision quality in association leadership context. If we have the trust, the teamwork that allows us to have candor in the boardroom and have constructive conflict, decision quality is improved. That's what the research shows. Now, we already mentioned a little bit about looking up and out, and it's so critical that we have that element at the board table, looking what is going on in our community, what should we be preparing ourselves for, so we're not reacting to things being done to us. Now, COVID was hard to understand that was really coming and what that was looking like. But in the general context of association leadership, the more we can look up and out to the future of our profession, community, as opposed to the rear view mirror of what has happened, what our experience has been. As we know, today is so different than it was a year ago. So my question to you is, how much time at your board meetings are you looking up and out into the future, or looking in the rear view mirror of decisions that you have made and understanding the operational elements around that? Are we looking to the future? Are we looking to the past of decisions and performance that we have made? The more time we spend looking up and out, the more we impact organizational performance. We'll get into how organizations do that really well. Now, I love this slide. It's a composite from some of our favorite lawyers, if you will, of what are they seen as the dysfunctions at the boardroom. Now, in your chat, you can reference one or two or three of these that you've seen in your board level, and we can discuss that via chat, if you will. But there are so many key elements of what this really means and how we treat each other and where we're spending our time at the leadership level. We do have that fiduciary responsibility, and we're not going to go into the elements of duties of care, loyalty, and obedience, even as important as they are, that we are mindful of these fiduciaries as leadership. But some of the other elements about how are we coming to the table? And one of the numbers here, 11, is members as representatives. And the question is, do we have that loyalty sense to the organization, or do we have a loyalty sense to an individual element of the organization? And that's why we have the capital R there. Our responsibility for leadership is to be for the greater good of the organization, even though we might represent a small element of it or a particular subset of the organization. What kind of dynamic does this put into our leadership discussions? We talked about motivation sometimes for issues and so on. So if there are other issues that are on your screen, we can respond via chat. But when we're face to face, frankly, we have a lot of fun with the slide and ask, what is your reaction to this? What have you experienced in it? Where are your hangups in advancing board discussion? Let's focus on a tool now from Board Source. You might be familiar with this. They are a resource for volunteer leadership. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but you do have a PDF of it. What we use this for is a placemat for our board meetings. It reminds us what are the essential ingredients in nonprofit leadership. And this translates so well to the association space. How are our board meetings constructed? What are we trying to achieve? Is there clarity in it? Do we have a strategic plan? Do we know where we're going and how we're allocating those resources? We have a streamlined structure today in our environment that that enables us to get consequential work done instead of prohibits us from getting consequential. The composition of the board and staff, do we have the right leadership in place that we can understand and curate that strategy and have those consequential discussions to advance the organization with strategic decisions? What's that composition of the leadership look like? And then the leadership of the board and the organization really talks about at the top line, the board chair and the key leadership elements coming together to work and advance the organization. We like to talk about board leadership being episodic. You're coming together periodically to advance strategies, and yet the board chair, and if you have an executive director, you're engaged more on an almost daily basis, if you will, of advancing strategies for the organization. So those dynamics of that smaller group are very critical in advancing strategy between board meetings, for instance. And then the mission, we need to be very clear of who we are and what we do. Do those pieces come together in a consequential way? As a one-page primer, I think this is essential for all board members to have and to understand. What does good governance look like? But we'd be remiss if we didn't really talk about the role of the board on a more strategy basis. We know we've got the fiduciary responsibilities. We do have some oversight elements, of course. But where do boards spend their time to advance consequential decisions? As Will Brown said, setting direction, curating strategy is critical. We need to spend ample time there, first and foremost. And then we are responsible for oversight. We do have the fiduciary responsibilities. Are we doing the right things well? That's a better question than ask, are we doing the right things well, than how are we doing on X, Y, and Z? Spending time at the leadership level on that overall question of how are we doing, instead of the elements of what are we doing, are different ballgames for the level of oversight. And then we all have limited resources of time, talent, and treasure today. As a board, we're responsible for ensuring we have the proper resources and then allocating to advance strategies for the organization. What does that look like? And then the last element is around planning succession. Do we have the right leaders in place, not only for today, but the pipeline for tomorrow? Are we spending time advancing those leadership succession issues? How do high-performing boards do that well? This agenda slide, again, we don't expect you to be able to review this right now, but you do have a PDF of it, and it is a consequential makeup for an organization. When you think about it, we bring ourselves together for a limited time and engagement at the board level. So we better understand what we're trying to achieve at these board meetings, whether they're virtual or face-to-face. I like this context that we borrowed from the Metal Construction Association, a board meeting many years ago. But they have their vision up front. What are they trying to achieve for the organization that will change the dynamics of that industry or community? And then for the opening remarks as a board chair, it's so important for you to set the stage. We are here for a limited time. We better make best use of that time. And so in the generative element, we're saying we want to be looking up and out first. We're going to tackle some opportunities or challenges in the context of the greater good. Strategy that will lead to strategy discussions. This is where we challenge ourselves intellectually. We become drained because we're asking questions. This sample here talks about what's going on in this environment today we need to be prepared for. Do we have the right workers in place that can understand the complexity of our product and how to install it? That's a consequential issue that is not going to be answered today. So that's why it's a generative discussion. But we better start thinking about it because it could greatly impact the future of this business organization. After we have this generative discussion, we get into strategy discussions. And at this time, we already have some strategic elements outlined. So we're advancing decisions or trying to remove barriers from pursuing these elements. And if you'll notice on the agenda there, they do have their success statement for each of those key strategies of the organization. And then if there's time, we get into operational issues. These are things we've already decided. We don't have any barriers to remove, but we want to know how are we doing? So you see the context of an agenda for a high-performing organization is looking up and out first, examining our strategies second, and making sure we have the allocation of resources properly aligned or removing barriers. And then if we have time, getting into the operational issues. and then closing the meeting with a recap of what decisions did we make. We had a lot of discussions here, but we might not have decided a lot. And that actually can be okay. We need to have concurrence on that. We'll dive into that further in a couple slides here. I mentioned to you I'm on 6 boards of directors, which can be exhausting, but I need to know what I need to do for each organization. I need clarity on expectations from the board, from the organization leadership, and of myself. And so I look at these 5 different domains for an individual board member's responsibility: preparation, engagement, decision, follow-up, and support. The most important element for an individual board member is come to that meeting prepared, and especially if we're at the board chair. Theoretically, we likely know more about almost every agenda item than any individual director there on every issue. Yes, they might be particularly knowledgeable about one particular issue, but overall, the board chair is leading the way. So if we are not reading and understanding the materials that we have in advance of a decision, then what example are we setting for the rest of the board members? Helping them determine what are the expectations, if they can see an agenda alignment saying, as we had in the prior slide, of generative, strategy, and operational, and they can understand how they're preparing their time. Here's where you're taxing me intellectually. Here's where you're asking me to examine the strategies we've already determined and possibly reallocate some resources. And here's where you're just informing and updating me. And if I understand that context in advance, I can determine the expectations of how to properly prepare. The single most important factor for an individual board member to advance organizational performance. And then was I there? Did I attend mentally, physically, emotionally? Did I participate? Was I constructive and respectful in my engagement of others? Did I dominate? Was I a wallflower? Did I have the opportunity to engage in a meaningful way? And then on the decision elements, was I mindful of my fiduciary responsibilities? And did I support the decision, even if I might not have agreed with it? You know, as a board, we're making a decision as a unit of one, comprised of individuals, but we are responsible for a decision. Even if the board voted 7-5 and I was one of the 5 against the decision, I'm still responsible to support that decision. What does that look like? And then did I meet my deadlines? I am sure that you're probably nagger in chief for your organization, getting people to conform to the deadlines and assignments. How do we do that well? The next slide's going to talk about an idea. And then am I a positive ambassador for the organization? And we like to say an ambassador and advocate for life. And I do that well. Just one more resource here. And again, this is on our website. I take this board meeting, and when I'm on the flight home, I go through it and say, how did I do at this board meeting? Was I prepared? Did I understand strategy? Was I properly engaged? I like that. How am I doing? And it's different from each board that I serve on and each board meeting that I serve. This is an accountability tool to myself and to the organization. This next element really helps us understand who is responsible for what. Minutes are important, and how can we streamline them so we understand what did we discuss, what did we decide, and who is responsible for follow-up on it. This kind of a method is a very abbreviated minuting format. So when I walk out of a meeting, this is, we create this together sometimes on the screen. I know what my responsibilities are. I also know what the decisions we made. We've discussed a lot, but we might not have made a lot of decisions. So what do esteemed board chairs do? There's an article that was just published in January for ASAE board briefings on what do esteemed board chairs do and how do they do it? And the context here is at this leadership level, and this is building on Will Brown and Nancy Axelrod particularly. We lead, we need to be focusing on strategy. If we're not strategically engaged, then how can we expect the rest of the board to? And yet we have to facilitate, we have to chair these board meetings. So we have to do that purposefully and timely and with clarity, but openly and freely, allowing people to engage in ways that are meaningful to them. We also need to participate. Again, we might be more informed on all the issues than everybody else, but we shouldn't necessarily lead with our opinions, especially if it's on strategy, because we want to engage the board first and we want to contribute our opinions and desires a second. We have a partnership with staff. How does that look? Are we supporting each other? And then the culture is critical for the board chair to be mindful of confronting inappropriate behavior, managing difficult conversations, and ensuring that we're fiduciary responsibility, if you will. The article is a good resource for that. That'll be linked on our website as well. The last thing we need to do is to celebrate the successes. And this is on an individual basis, but also on an organizational basis. We have to be mindful that people are volunteering their valuable time. So recognition helps motivate them and bring in additional volunteer leaders. It creates a sense of belonging for us. There's an esteem around the organization of people are bringing their talent here, and we're learning from the best and brightest within our industry and profession. Let's recognize that. Also, recognition allows us to close a piece of work. And so often we never have a project that ends. So it allows us to say, thank you for your contributions. And there's a finality to that element of the process. Sometimes it's done via banquets or meetings or what have you for that, bringing that recognition together. It can also be done via the newsletter and website. So we also like not only on a public basis, but a private basis, the power of an individual note. Could be an email or text, but even more grateful is a private handwritten note saying, thank you, you actually care. So this element about peer recognition is critical in the volunteer space. So we can't underestimate the meaningfulness of this. So I love this quote at the end with Martin Luther King saying, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And we know the answer for you, because you're a volunteer leader, is it is about others. It's putting their needs first. And the spirit of volunteerism is so critically important in associations. So I want to thank you for what that looks like and how you are working to advance your organization and, frankly, advancing society. So let's now engage in some more Q&A and discussion. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you very much for your presentation and the engagement in chat. We saw a lot of great discussion and thoughts going back and forth, and we have several different questions for you. So I will start to read a few of them. And I encourage, again, anyone in the audience to please submit your questions via the Q&A pod for Mark. The first question here, creative visioning and thinking, and the ability to both imagine the possibilities and enroll others in our vision is a critical function of leadership. However, we often see meetings descend into the weeds where everyone is pointing out why a new idea won't work or why something is not practical to implement. Can you share any practical ways to help keep us looking out and not in during these discussions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. I saw that Stephanie posted that during the session. It's so critical to be thinking like this. And somebody else mentioned, you know, as structural engineers, we're expected, we are trained to look into elements and look deeply, right? And yet at the board level, we need to be thinking broadly, looking broadly. And we love the concept of, as a board member, are you a guardian of the organization and the programs, or a steward of the organization and the programs? Very different context, right? A guardian is somebody who's protecting. A steward is somebody who's looking up and out saying, how can we use the assets we have, which are very heavily in the time and talent in your domain? How do we use those to scale and really improve the community? So first of all, it is the mindset. Are we in this guardian mode, or are we in this stewarding mode? And then do we have the construct for people to participate in a way that is either familiar or comfortable for them? So if we're sitting around a board table, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, have we allowed the time for people to digest their thoughts and share them? Because we find that the people who speak first are the extroverts like me. We think to speak. or actually I should say we speak to think. The introverts like to think to speak. And if we allowed the time for people to process, to be thoughtful first in their comments, so we don't start with why something cannot happen, why it cannot work. And we're always looking through that critical lens, whether it's our professional training or just nature for us. So how do we provide that time and space for people to process and to be thinking about that? You know, when we had that sample agenda, Al, we were talking about the generative element first. And if we can set the stage saying, we do not know the answers to this question before us or this opportunity before us. But before we shut it down, let's think about what it could look like. And I think this is back to Stephanie's question of how do you create it in a positive landscape? You know, if we're face to face, we can have 2 flip charts and ask people to get up and say, all right, what are the pros of this issue? What are the cons of this issue? Now we expect the cons are going to be twice as deep as the pros. But let's focus on the pros first so we can get that energy and enthusiasm and dream. Does this make sense? Could this work? Instead of why could it not work? So providing that context in the leadership level, whether you're the board chair or the session leader on an idea, of not allowing the energy to be guardian first or the one who takes it apart saying why not first. We are not at that stage yet. We're at the positive, we're at the pros stage first. There are several different elements, whether it's the World Cafe. We also have a calming exercise that we like to use in this space that allows us to not just focus on the negative elements. That's too easy, and it should not be easy in the boardroom, right?
Good. I'm going to combine 2 questions that came in into one. The leadership, the volunteer leaders at our state level with their state SEAs are often also performing the day-to-day functions of the organization because they may not have paid staff. How do those volunteer leaders perform the strategic side of the organization while also having to balance the day-to-day? And there's a question that came up that kind of relates to this was, do you suggest at board meetings breaking out the sections into strategic planning versus other areas of the board when you're having these meetings? So maybe you kind of address that. How do you balance strategic versus day-to-day?
Yeah, that's a great question, Al, especially in the context of what hat do I have on, right? And we know you can never take off your hat because if you're also the staff leader, you also have to be practical. I have to be able to implement something at some point, but that's further downstream in the discussion. And so that's why we like the generative, strategic, and operational components of an agenda. At the generative element, we're not solving problems. We're not answering questions of how things cannot be done. We're looking up and out at what could be done, what could be done to really advance our organization or structural engineering, or particularly within our state. So it's not problem solving at that element. And so even if you're the staff one who's going to be responsible for it, liberate yourself, give yourself permission, and sometimes you can have a constructive conversation with the board saying, I am taking this hat off now. Because we don't want to stymie conversation, whether it's me from thinking about implementation or somebody else saying why it cannot happen. Give ourselves permission in the generative element, the generative stage of our board meetings, to focus on what can be done. Why should we be advancing something instead of why not? That can come later. And as Rose asked, do you incorporate strategic planning within your agendas? And I guess the answer is depends. If you're meeting monthly, you need to have strategy discussions as part of your agenda, but more of a formal strategic planning or an examination of overall strategy to us is a conscious exercise. And so, if you're meeting quarterly, the answer is different. If you're meeting monthly, the answer is different. But our recommendation is you do take concentrated time to break away to say, this meeting is different. We're going to be focusing on strategy. We don't really care about form and process. Robert's Rules is out the door, for instance. We want to be focusing on strategy. And to do that, we have to have the context of understanding what is important to us. One of the other questions we were getting into earlier, Al, was around value proposition. How do you determine that? This is an excellent example of that strategy examination. Take the time to step away, put yourself in a different box, whether it's physically in a different space, or even if the room is set up, if you're physically there, or using breakouts and so on, and asking yourself around these key questions. I love Jim Collins, who wrote the book Good to Great. He's a great researcher on management and strategy. He has 3 simple questions, which I think the boards should examine every year. You know, what are you passionate about? What are you best at? Where do you make your money? I mean, we do have to have a margin in this business, otherwise we're not sustainable. What are you passionate about? What are you best at? And where do you make your money? And asking those questions each year is going to be a little bit of a different answer, because one, you're going to hopefully have some different people at the table each year with a little bit of new infusion of leadership. The context is going to change, whether we have COVID or not, or what's happening in the structural engineering domain. So your answers should be a little bit different each year, and having the opportunity to break away and examine those types of questions is important. So we do like a formal element each year of saying, let's set the space aside to do this strategy work at a high level and have that examination.
Mark Ken Odell from our Southern California group said, he talked about their separate spaces and how they break out their meetings into 2, one for short tactical consent items and financials, and then a separate meeting entirely for strategic to keep them focused.
Yeah, I love that concept. And so actually the slide that we shared with you from MCA during virtual times, we did break that into 2 separate meetings. One is generative, and we said this looks different, it's going to feel different. We're not about to get accomplishment done. Then the second one, which would be the following day, was around, all right, let's make sure we've got alignment of our strategies and the resources for it, and get into operations as necessary. So it's just very much keeping in line with what Ken was saying is, let's separate this. Let's make it look different. Let's make it feel different so the expectations are different. We look and feel the same way for every board meeting, we're highly likely to get the same results.
A little bit of a multi-part question here. You referenced value proposition a couple times. Could you take that down to the basics for us and define it a little bit more for associations? And then ultimately, could you give a few examples of value propositions you may have seen from associations as they would appeal to maybe the younger generation, the younger demographic out there? And then I'm going to add even a third slant, and you may say this is way too much, but one of the struggles is always what's with the pandemic the last year. That value proposition has changed dramatically. Maybe there are examples you've seen of what associations have done in the last year that you thought were creative or unique ways to address that question for their membership.
Well, one of the key things we've seen in the last year is that people want to gather. And I don't mean well, yes, they want to meet face-to-face, obviously, but they know that they can't, right? And so what does that mean on a gathering basis? What are you doing? What are you challenged with? Because I suspect we're feeling the same pain. So that communication element has been on steroids for the last 15 or 16 months, right? How are you doing it? What are you impacted with? We all want to know. So the sense of community that we're experiencing in the association environment is more robust than it's ever been before. At the same time, the sense of competition in our space is more robust than it's ever been before. And while we don't have a lot of time to get into some of these generational dynamics, my kids are 30 to 34 years old. They look and they think differently. Well, they don't look differently, but they look a lot like my wife, which is the good news. But they think a lot differently. They learn a lot differently. And have we examined what we are offering within our community, within our associations, especially to that next generation? Because they are getting it. Are they getting it from us? Are they getting that sense of community and answers? Or are they getting it elsewhere? And they can get it elsewhere so much easier today than before. So let's go back to your value proposition. And there's really 2 elements on that I love to see put together. One is the vision of what are we trying to achieve? And then secondly is the values, which really kind of gets to, and how are we doing that? And so my favorite vision statement is from the Institute of Food Technologists, the food scientists, who their vision a generation ago was abundant, safe food supply for all. Now, I've remembered this for 15 years and working with them, and it's as crystal clear to me today as it was before. And I'm not a food scientist, and yet every step that organization takes towards achieving abundant, safe food supply for all changes the world. In structural engineering, you are all about safety and structure in a safe environment in the building envelope or whatever community that you're in this space. How important is that? And so if we can grasp that value proposition, especially for the early careerists, say, this is why I got into it, and do you feel the passion for it? Then they want to know, and how does that look? Emily talked a little bit about your DEI elements early on. Are we a welcoming environment? Are we an encouraging environment? Or is our environment stuck in the past? Do I have the opportunity to bring and learn leadership skills in your space, or do I have to go elsewhere for it? Is it a closed culture or is it open? Do you have change in leadership, or is it the same people doing the same, not necessarily the same things, but is that leadership pipeline, just a very closed loop, or is it a very open loop that I can bring my skill sets to you? And so that's that value proposition. And we have to be very mindful, hopefully, of the early careerists, because they're trying to see right now, are you my community, or do I get that elsewhere? And they have been trained and conditioned to look elsewhere. Whereas you and me in our generation, we've been trained to get our identity through NCSEA, or for you and me, ASAE maybe, within our space. This next generation does not think that way. And so are we opening ourselves up to encourage them to participate, to get leadership skills and contributions inside of us, or are we sending them outside? The value proposition has to resonate to them much more than it does to you and me.
To help us kind of put a wrap on this discussion today, a final question for you that you've hit numerous times, but I'd like to see if we can maybe wrap it up as a final answer. If you were to give advice to the volunteer leaders in our industry, what lessons have they learned, or what takeaways from the last year do we need to keep making sure we push forward in our associations as we go back to a more regular situation, a more regular normal? What are those lessons learned? What are those takeaways that we need to keep moving forward with, even if we all can come together again?
Yeah, it's a great question, Al. And we've done so many interviews with staff leaders and lawyers in the association space and volunteer leaders. And one of the first questions I like to ask is about strategy. And as we encourage organizations and boards to look up and out, the ones that we put in that classification of high-performing boards have not changed their strategies. Now, they may have reprioritized some resources temporarily, but they've examined themselves and they said, our strategies are still valid. The application might be different, the priorities might be different, but the strategies are still valid. And when we think about it, are we spending time in our boardrooms, and are our strategies at such a high level that they really aren't challenged by COVID other than timing and resources? But the ultimate end game we're trying to achieve, has that changed? And in high-performing boards, the answer has consistently been no. And they've actually been the healthier organizations too, with reserves and programs that endure. They might change the application in COVID, but they're really enduring programs. That means they're looking up and out enough and providing that value within their community that they can sustain this. So if we are challenged, and I know we've all been challenged with upending education programs and conferences and exhibits and all that jazz. Of course, we've been upended with that. But have we been able to change our application of the key fundamentals that we add value to our community? So if our strategies have stayed the same and the application has changed, are we going to be sustainable for the future? That's a key question in the boardroom. And if the answer is no, then we better examine, are our strategies big enough? And are we challenging ourselves enough to attract the people of the future, the early careerists and mid-careerists, to really stay within our community and help us thrive and drive success? Or are we sending them away? That's a difficult answer. And it is the responsibility of the board, right? We need to be looking up and out and making sure we're allocating the resources to get the important things done, that strategy.
Well, Mark, on behalf of NCSEA, thank you for your very thought-provoking presentation today.
It's a pleasure, Al. And again, I point you to our resources on our website. We have a lot of articles and research there. Our goal is to support board members to thrive and be successful. Thank you and your staff and your leadership for what you do. And it's important work. So thank you.
Before we close today's session, I want to be sure to remind everybody to please register for the upcoming committee interaction sessions, SEA education sessions, and the closing celebration occurring throughout this week as part of the SEA Leadership Retreat. It's a phenomenal time to engage with your other volunteer leadership and the NCSEA leadership. Please visit the website to register for these events. Thank you for attending today's welcome and keynote session. We look forward to seeing you throughout the rest of the week.